Hello, good evening and welcome. Sunday School for June the 13th. And we're doing a look at 1 Kings 20, verses 26 to 43, leaving off where we finished last week. First, little commercial. Because one or two of you have suggested you'd like to get hold of recordings of some of the earlier messages in this series, I've been praying about that, and I believe that God is leading me to put some of these teaching notes into a book. They'd have to be rewritten for reading, but it would be at least next spring before we got ready to publish, at least. But my question is to you is, what do you think of that? I'd like to hear from you because you are my current audience, and I'd like to know what you think of that, whether you think it's a good idea or a foolish idea. We'll be praying about that. End of commercial. Now let's turn to today's reading. Do you often wonder why apparently sinful people prosper while some of God's people struggle? And the people prosper even though they may be deceitful in their business practices or their activities, and it still seems to turn up good for them. If you have that, you'll probably share with me and wonder why the idolatrous king Ahab, married to his wicked wife Jezebel, seems to overcome both in last week's reading and again this week. So pause the video and turn to 1 Kings chapter 20. Okay, you're ready. We're at 1 Kings chapter 20, and we're going to start at verse 26, which is where we left off last week. So, in the spring, Ben-Hadad mustered the Syrians and went up to Aphek to fight against Israel. And the people of Israel were mustered and were provisioned and went against them. The people of Israel camped before them like two little flocks of goats, but the Syrians filled the country. And a man of God came near and said to the king of Israel, Thus says the Lord, because the Syrians have said, The Lord is the God of the hills, but he is not the God of the valleys, therefore I will give all this great multitude into your hand, and you will know that I am Lord. And they encamped opposite one another 7 days, and then on the 7th day the battle was joined, and the people of Israel struck down the Syrians, 100,000 foot soldiers in one day. And the rest fled to the city of Aphek, and the wall fell upon them, 27,000 men who were left. Ben-Hadad also fled and entered an inner chamber in the city. And his servants said to him, Behold, now we have heard that the kings of Israel are merciful kings. Let us put sackcloth around our waist and ropes on our heads and go out to the king of Israel. Perhaps he will spare your life. So they tied sackcloth around their waists, and they put ropes on their heads and went to be king of Israel. And said, Your servant Ben-Hadad says, Please let me live. And he said, Does he still live? He's my brother. Now the men who were watching for a sign, and they quickly took it up from him, said, Yes, your brother Ben-Hadad. Then he said, Go and bring him here. Then Ben-Hadad came out to him, and he caused him to come up into the chariot. And Ben-Hadad said to him, The cities that my father took from your father I will restore, and you may establish bazaars for yourself in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria. And Ahab said, I will let you go on these terms. And he made a covenant with him, and let him go. A certain man of the sons of the prophets said to his fellow command of the Lord, Strike me, please. But the man refused to strike him. Then he said to him, Because you have not obeyed the voice of the Lord, behold, as soon as you have gone from me, a lion shall strike you down. And as soon as he departed from him, a lion got him and struck him down. Then he found another man and said, Strike me, please. And the man struck him and wounded him. So the prophet departed and waited for the king by the way, disguising himself with a bandage over his eyes. And as the king passed, he cried to the king and says, Your servant went out into the midst of the battle, and behold, a soldier turned and brought a man to me and said, Guard this man. If by any means he is missing, your life shall be for his life, or else you shall pay a talent of silver. And as your servant was busy here and there, he was gone. The king of Israel said to him, So shall your judgment be, you yourself have decided it. Then he hurried to take a bandage from his eyes, and the king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. And then he said to him, Thus says the Lord, because you have let go out of your hand the man who I had devoted to destruction, therefore your life shall be for his life, and your people for his people. And the king of Israel went into his house, vexed and sullen, and came to Samaria. There are quite a lot of talking points in this passage, so I'm going to try and sort of break it down a bit. Firstly, cast your mind back to last week and the beginning of this chapter. Remember where we are. Ahab's army of Israel had defeated Ben-Hadad's numerically superior invading Syrian army in a battle that took place in the hills, so allowing Ahab to avoid a set-piece pitched battle. Ben-Hadad had retreated, blaming the terrain, and planning to come back next year with a bigger army and do battle on the plains where the superiority of numbers could be expected to give him a victory. As the army retreated, a prophet had warned Ahab that the Syrians would return in the spring, and Ahab would need to be ready. The prophecy proves true, and here they are, staring at each other across the valley. The Israelites likened to two flocks of goats surrounded by Ben-Hadad's 100-strong army. The idea that particular gods had authority over particular areas was common in those days. And because the recent victory was won on the hilly terrain, the servants of the king of Syria, believed that the God of Israel was a local deity and with power over the hills, and they thought they could avoid him by taking the battle onto the plains. It says that the God was annoyed because the Syrians had thought that God was not omnipresent and omnipowerful. The key for us is whether we believe that God is God over all of our lives or just parts of it. Is he God over Monday to Saturday as he is God over Sunday? Are there parts of our lives where we're still trying to run things our own way rather than submitting to God's will, which may or may not be what our idea is? I've seen too many amazing things not to believe in a God of fantastic miracles. One thing puzzled me here is that in spite of Ahab's idolatry and his rejection of the true God again and again, God is still prepared to show his strength. There is no doubt that God would have been annoyed by the suggestion that Ben-Hadad had made that he only had authority over certain things, and by suggesting that he's God over the hills and not over the valleys. Was that alone enough to give cause to give Ahab the victory with which the prophet promises? I personally think that God is still trying to demonstrate his omnipotent power to Ahab and the Israelites. He hasn't given up on Ahab yet. It's interesting, the army of Israel is outnumbered here almost 10-1. I couldn't help thinking of the words of Henry V before Agincourt, that these are fearful odds. In those days when battle consisted of hacking away at each other until one army is either dead or flees the field, it's almost ludicrous to think this tiny army of Ahab's could be victorious. Only God could do this. So after 7 days of facing off against each other, battle is joined, and surprise, surprise, Ahab's tiny army defeats the Syrians, killing over 70,000 on the battlefield and sending the others in flight, many of whom die when the walls collapse in the town where they seek refuge. This was clearly a miracle, yet it was a miracle working through the existing Israeli army, not by any other outside agency. God wanted to show that, as unlikely as it seemed, he could work through this outwardly weak and ineffective group of people. In the early part of this chapter, Ben-Hadad spoke severe threats against Ahab and the kingdom of Israel. Now he's beaten and on the run. He knows that he can hide in this town for a while, but eventually Ahab is going to come and find him. So he humbles himself as much as he could to win mercy and favor from the unexpectedly triumphant king of Israel. There's no doubt that Ahab feels some empathy towards this pagan. This pagan king had exceedingly pagan ideas of God, and Ahab perhaps was looking for Ben-Hadad and Syria's friendship as protection against the powerful and threatening Assyrian Empire, which is becoming more and more powerful to the north. If that is so, subsequent events show that he looked for friends in the wrong places. But that's another story. Ahab had no business making this treaty. The victory was the Lord's and did not belong to Ahab, and Ahab had no right to negotiate away this victory. How many times in the Old Testament do the children of Israel make mistakes because they did not inquire of the Lord? I think of the encounter with the Gibeonites. Then I think of when the messengers were sent into the promised land and came back and said they're too big a giants for us. And although God had brought them to the promised land, the Israelites did not go forward because they wouldn't take God's will instead of their own. They did not inquire of the Lord. Ahab, certainly, being a proponent of idolatry, he was not going to inquire of the Lord. How many times do we choose the wrong way because we do not inquire of the Lord? Now in verse 35 it says, "A certain man of the sons of the prophets said." Now this seems to be a different prophet from the man mentioned earlier in the chapter. This is another reminder that there were 7,000 faithful followers of Yahweh that were active in Israel. Now, although this prophet is not named, Josephus in his writings believed that the anonymous man of God introduced in verse 35 was Micah, who figures so prominently in the next chapter. He suggested it was a retaliation for Micah's prophetic condemnation that the king put him in prison. Now the prophet, whether it was Micah or not, disguised with a bandage over his eyes and a wound that he got someone to inflict on him, waited for the king to arrive. He was going to deliver a message to King Ahab from God. The prophet uses a made-up story with a fictional excuse that becomes the real in the life of many. It's all about doing what you are called to do. You see, in the story, the man was told he had to look after this man, and because he was busy here and there, he never looked after the man, and the man got away. And that's the story he tells to King Ahab. You know, if someone is called to preach the word and becomes busy over 100 other things than that of his central work and loses his opportunity to preach, he has failed in a God-sent mission. What has God told you to do that you've been procrastinating about? What God has appointed, we must do. And if we fail in that, the fact that we've been busy here and there doing all sorts of other things is not going to cut it. We are still failing to do what God has sent us to do. God intended Ben-Hadad to be utterly destroyed. Why else would, after the 27,000 had fled the field of battle, the walls of the city fell on top of them? Coincidence or God? God doesn't make mistakes. But God had intended Ben-Hadad should be utterly destroyed at the hand of the army of Israel. God was interested in more than the mere death of Ben-Hadad, but also in the way the death came about. We're told Ahab was sullen and displeased. It does not say that Ahab was repentant. He knew that he had done wrong in God's eyes, but he was not going to admit that it was his own fault. You may think that I'm being harsh comparing our Christian lives to Ahab. After all, we're not idol worshippers, are we? But how many times do we choose our own way instead of God's? Either because we prefer our own way, or because we didn't inquire of the Lord. Spend a lot of time in prayer this week, asking God to show you the task He has for you and His way of carrying it out. Be blessed. I'll see you next week.